Good evening. We're going to get started. My name is David Penny. I am the Associate Director for Museum Scholarship here at the National Museum of the American Indian, and we feel enormously privileged to be able to host you here at the National Museum of the American Indian this evening. You have a lot of choices, a lot of things to see, a lot of things to look at in Washington, D.C. during your visit, and we're very glad that you're here. If you haven't been to the National Museum of the American Indian in the past few years, you'll notice, if you look around, a lot of changes. We've almost completely redone the galleries from its original inaugural suite of installations. There's only one left. Our universe is up on the 4th floor. I invite you to take a look at the exhibition we opened about a year and a half ago, Nation to Nation, Treaties Between the United States and American Indian Nations. I'm happy to report at the American Alliance of Museums meeting here last week, we received an award for overall excellence in exhibitions for that exhibition. So we're very proud of it, and we think it really helps set the story straight in many different ways, and invite you to take a look at that. We also opened a fantastic exhibition featuring our own original research by Ramiro Matos, our resident archaeologist, about the Inca Road, and that's receiving a great deal of attention as well. And then if you like to think about contemporary art, last fall we opened up the largest exhibition ever devoted to a female native artist, our retrospective of cave walking sticks work over the past, 40 years or so. Fantastic exhibition, and we hope you get to spend some time with that as well. But this evening, we're going to hear a marvelous presentation by my colleague, Michael Witkin. I spent 30 years in Detroit, Michigan at the Detroit Institute of Arts, and I'm very familiar with the Anishinaabe world that he'll be speaking to you about tonight. And we'll hear a little bit more about him. Right now, I'd like to introduce our host for this evening, Ralph Bauer, Associate Professor at the Department of English Comparative Literature here at the University of Maryland. Ralph.
Thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to introduce to you this evening's speaker, whose lecture is also a keynote address in a conference currently taking place at the University of Maryland at College Park and at various locations in the Washington, D.C. area, with the generous support of the Kislak Family Foundation, the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, the Society of Early Americanists, the Buckner W. Clay Endowment at the University of Virginia Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures, the University of Maryland, the Mexican Cultural Institute, and of course our host tonight, the National Museum of the American Indian. In particular, at the National Museum of the American Indian, I would like to thank Elizabeth Guichet, Mark Hirsch, Cheryl Perry, Anthony Bullard, and our host tonight, David Penny. Our keynote speaker tonight is one of the leading figures in Native American studies in the United States today. Michael Witkin is an associate professor in the Department of History in the program in American Culture at the University of Michigan, and he's a member of the Red Cliff Band of the Lake Superior Ojibwe. His publications are numerous, including An Infinity of Nations, How the Native New World Shaped Early North America, which is published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2012. Professor Witkin's work explores the juxtaposition of Native and European experiences and responses to the process of mutual discovery that created the New World in North America, with particular focus on the Great Lakes and the Great Plains. In addition, he has published influential articles in such important journals as Ethnohistory, the William & Mary Quarterly, and the Western Historical Quarterly. He has held various prestigious fellowships from such institutions as the Ford Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, Fulbright, Harvard University, and the Dorothy McNichol Center for the Study of the American Indian at the Newberry Library in Chicago. He is currently at work on a book project entitled Native Sons, Indigenous Land, Black Lives, and the Political Economy of Plunder in North America, which examines the intersection of race, national identity, and state-making on America's northern borderlands. The title of his talk today is Being Noka Bear Clan, The Murder Trials of Daniel Duluth and the Lessons of Cultural and Linguistic Translations. Please please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Witkin.
Thank you. I can't really hear what was said because I was standing back there and all the volume was out there. So, Michael Witkin, University of Michigan. I wanted to thank Ralph and Allison for asking me to do this talk. I'm doing a book in the 19th century, so it was nice to kind of go back to my first book and return back to the colonial period, which is actually the period that I was trained to do. So let me start. So this will be a very Great Lakes-centric talk, and my wife has reminded me that lots of people don't know where Manitoulin Island or Keweenaw or Sault Ste. Marie is, so I'll try my best to make sure that when I say these words, I'm pointing out where they're from. But we're going to talk about a series of murders that happened in 1683 when 3 Anishinaabe warriors murdered 2 French traders while they were portaging the Keweenaw Peninsula. That's this little space right there. Now, the identity of these murders was widely known throughout Anishinaabe-Wauke, which is the Great Lakes homeland of Anishinaabe peoples. And because the identity was widely known, pretty soon French colonial officials and fur traders who were in the region also became aware of who had committed these murders. And this was important, especially because 2 of the young men involved in this affair were the sons of Ashiganaga, the Bass, who was a prominent leader of the Noka Dodem, that's the Bear Clan. The Bear Clan served as keepers of the war pipe for the Lake Superior Anishinaabe. I'll try not to keep looking back at my map. I think that's going to make some of the sound. But so the sons of this prominent war leader had participated in the killing of these French traders, and they had done this not as a random act of violence, but in order to send a message to the French and to Daniel Duluth, who was a primary French military officer in the Great Lakes. The problem was that Daniel Duluth sort of misinterpreted the meaning of this message, and his misinterpretation of events unwittingly placed the French in the middle of a power struggle among the Anishinaabe Dodemek, the Anishinaabe clans who were vying for control of the fur trade alliance network that linked the western interior of North America to the Atlantic world economy. But before we talk about the murders, we have a little brief prologue, and I'm going to introduce one of the main protagonists to the story. The first, of course, is Daniel Duluth. Duluth was a French military officer who made his way to the New World, to New France, in order to make his fortune. And if you're a Frenchman hoping to make your fortune in New France, you get involved in the fur trade. Duluth made his way out west in 1678 without a fur trading license. You had to have a license to be able to legally trade. He had a rich merchant uncle, which was just as good as a license. So he made his way out west. He also may or may not have been collaborating with the Count of Frontenac, who's the governor of New France. This governor notoriously colluded or sort of financed a lot of illegal traders. And Duluth, in fact, wrote him a series of letters. The reason we know about these murders and what happened is that he wrote painstaking letters where he explained exactly what had happened, why he was doing what he was doing, and also kind of asking for permission to be out here in retrospect. He claimed that he was out discovering new territory for France and finding new native allies for the French Empire, and that was a justification for this. But the other person we meet in this little prologue is a man named Wamamin. Wamamin is an Amiquois Dodemek, or an Amiquois clan person. He's a Gijigdoinawak, a speaker for this clan Dodem, which means he's not a sort of civil leader, but rather he's a person who's an orator or a speaker who often can serve as a mediator or a go-between. And he arrives at the Falls of St. Mary, Boiting, at the same time as Daniel Duluth in the fall of 1678. He too is coming on a mission. He's coming not from his home territory, which would be below the falls. The Falls of St. Mary, or this little region here, the river that connects Lake Superior to Lake Huron. There's a passage with waterfalls that everybody has to get out and portage. So it's a natural sort of gathering point and village place, and it's super important as a sort of gateway to the west. And so Waman comes from the west, from actually the region west of Lake Superior, on a mission. He's hoping to find a French person who can mediate a trade an alliance that he's negotiating between the Dakota in the upper Mississippi Valley and the Shagwamagon Anishinaabe, that is the Anishinaabe people from the west end of Lake Superior, this village in this region here. And he arrives and asks the French Jesuits at Sault Ste. Marie if they would serve as a mediator. The Jesuits tell him they're not sure, they'll need to think about it for a day. And the Jesuits think about what this would mean, because the Dakota are not allies of New France. The Anishinaabe peoples are all allies of New France, or in the language of the French alliance system, in the language of empire, they are children of the French father. The Dakota are definitely not children of the French father. In fact, they had been, for the most part, enemies of most Anishinaabe people. They are definitely sort of outsiders in terms of empire. And as they thought about empire, they thought about it in terms of patriarchy. That is, in terms of people who are subject to the French king. And this overlapped with how Native peoples thought about their own social world in terms of kinship. And in this sense, the Dakota were neither sort of subjects of the French Empire nor kin or allied relatives of the Anishinaabe, so the priest told Wamamin no. So Wamamin, the white berry, while he's waiting for this decision, here's word that Daniel Duluth is asking about for somebody to take him into the West. And so he asks Duluth if he would care to accompany him. And Duluth asks him why he would go out west. And Wamamin confesses that he had come to find somebody to mediate a peace. And then he backtracks and he says that he wasn't aware that the French didn't want such a peace to happen. At which point, Daniel Duluth, and he writes to the governor, informs him that he is wrong, that the priests were wrong. That, quote, in making peace between the Sauteurs and the Dakota, they could make you, the governor, no greater pleasure, unquote. Let me pause here to say that the Anishinaabe people, the sort of real human, would refer to real human beings, also often refer to themselves by clan designations or by village affiliations, and Sauteur was one such designation. This was essentially the French translation for Batchewana Irani, the sort of people of the falls, or in French, Sauteurs. So when Wamamin learns that Duluth will accompany him back out into the West, he's delighted. At least that's what Duluth says. And he provides another quote for Duluth. He tells him that peace would be, quote, a rebirth for the Sauteurs in the Dakota. And he informs him that the region that these people live in is, in fact, a nursery for beavers. And this is exactly what Duluth is after. It's a little early. So they agreed to go out west. And as they're prepared to leave, at least in Duluth's letter, he says Wamamin seems a little downcast. And so he asks him what's bothering him. And Wamamin tells him that he saw something threatening from the people of the North. Quote, this was the people of the North. They who are at war with the Sioux will be an obstacle to our enterprise, unquote. And Duluth informs Wamamin that he doesn't need to fear. And he writes this to the governor as well, and says that he'll travel north, quote, to tell them to be careful what they do, since they cannot kill the Sioux without killing us. That is, they can't kill the Sioux without attacking the French. And he promises that as soon as he's done negotiating a peace with the Sioux in the West, he'll go to the people of the North and make sure that they're aware of this. Now, the people of the North, we'll switch from this map. This map is a map produced by the Jesuits at Sault Ste. Marie. It's a very orderly map. It's a map that's meant to reflect empire. It's really also a map that's been drawn for other Europeans. That is, one of the things you might notice is that there are no actual native peoples on this map. What you do have instead are missionaries or missions, the places where French have missionary posts. And there's a text that accompanies this, and the Indians who are at each mission are described in that text. The only Indians who are on this map are the Gens de Terre and the Sioux, both of whom we'll talk about in a minute. And these are people who are not part of the alliance, which seems to get them on the map. Now, this next map represents the region from north of Lake Superior and Hudson's Bay. It's kind of inaccurate geographically, but I put it up there to give you a sense of who the people of the North are. This is a map that's not meant for European consumption, but actually produced by Jesuits for travel. And it's densely marked, and you can see they use indigenous place names, they mark which clans are in which spaces. And this is a map that shows you how complicated this northern world is that Wamamin is worried about. It's a sort of world of small clans and small villages. It's what I've referred to in my first book as an infinity of nations, because French officials, when they're confronted with these peoples and the social structures that are way less hierarchical than they're used to with people, say, like the Iroquois or the Huron, think that there are, quote, an infinity of nations out there. And they worry about that infinity of nations because they're worried that some other European power will find them, discover them, and through that process of discovery, claim that territory. So this is a constellation that he's worried about. It's a combination of Anishinaabe people, Cree-speaking peoples, and Assiniboine peoples. And Duluth has assured him that they will, in fact, make peace with these people. These are also people who move their trade between French posts in places like Sault Ste. Marie and Mackinac, and Hudson's Bay Post on the coast. In fact, this other map is a map drawn by Hudson's Bay officials. You can see it's also very different. And these maps all have their own design. This map, of course, is produced so that you can navigate Hudson's Bay from the sea. And you can see there's very little knowledge of the sort of indigenous interior. And it's kind of a reflection of how the Hudson's Bay Company works. They have posts situated at the mouths of rivers that drain out into Hudson's Bay. And their commerce with Indians consists of what Indians come to their post to trade with them. But these people in the northern interior who Wammen worries will sabotage the alliance are not only hunting in the interior, but they're shifting their trade between Hudson's Bay posts and French posts in the Great Lakes. So Wammen and Daniel Duluth make their way into the west. This is yet another map. This one's drawn by Louis Hennepin, who's a French Recollect priest who's out in this space at the same time period. And here you can see the connections. The space between the Mississippi and the Great Lakes is sort of intercut with waters and lakes and watersheds that connect these two bodies of water. And it's in this space where the best prime winter coat beaver can be found, and where the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples are increasingly in competition for those furs and find themselves in violent conflict. This is the conflict that Wammen hopes to resolve. Now, when they make their way into the west after they leave Sault Ste. Marie, they don't go to Chequamegon, the principal village of the Ojibwe, and they don't go to the principal villages of the Dakota peoples either. Instead, they pass the winter in this marshy terrain in between these two spaces where there are small encampments of mixed people, Dakota and Anishinaabe people, who are passing the winter in small winter bands hunting beaver. And Wammen and Duluth move from camp to camp, and as they do, they perform a series of rituals. They marry young people from these different communities together. They engage in a ritual exchange process where the Anishinaabe people exchange wampum, a sort of diplomatic gift of beads, but they also have the French with them, and the French are trading with these small encampments for the beaver that they've been hunting. And that is an amplification of the sort of gift exchange process that creates and signals an ongoing relationship. It's what makes it work. Part of what the Dakota are being offered with this alliance is access to the Atlantic world, access to the fur trade, or the manufactured goods of the fur trade. And after this winter moving through band to band to band, Duluth returns back to Montreal and declares himself a success, but not before he first goes to the banks of the Mississippi, plants the King's coats of arms, and declares a formal possession of the Mississippi in the West, and claims the Dakota as allies of New France and their territory for the king and for the governor of New France. And this, of course, we can realize one of the things that Duluth says in his letter is that he's extended French sovereignty out into the West. And this, of course, is really a hollow claim. The French have no authority, no ability to project power. They have no post in this region. But it is a claim that Duluth establishes. What you can see beyond Duluth's claim, though, from his discussion about how the trade has worked and how the peace was hammered out, is that this was actually a quite successful engagement for both the Dakota and for the Anishinaabe at Chequamegon. For the Dakota, they secure their northern border from this constellation of northern Indians who are both in competition for furs but also raiding into their territory. It gives them a sanction of the French. It connects them to empire in a way that they weren't connected. And also, equally important, it provides them with more steady access of trade goods. They begin to acquire not only weapons, but also other goods, and they begin to pivot toward the Great Plains, where they can use their weapons and trade goods to acquire horses more rapidly than other peoples, arm themselves before other people gain arms. So for the Sioux, this is a very successful alliance. It's quite important. And for the Anishinaabe people of Chequamegon, it also gets them better, secure access to this same region, where they are in competition with, in the past, the Dakotas, but also with these various peoples to the north. This makes for a much more stable environment, so the political economy of the fur trade, the sort of seasonal hunting that involves trapping beaver for producing pelts to trade with the French, is way more productive and way more secure. So it's a win for both of those parties. Like as I said, this is important in part because this is a struggle not just about the fur trade on a local level, but really about how to position your community within the larger global market economy that is emerging at this time. And when I said that, when I wrote the first book and I talked about a global market economy, I got some pushback from readers about whether or not that was true. And it is. What you have is, take my word for it, I said to the readers. But then I actually did spell it out. You've got people in the Great Plains. So you've got Dakota and Yankton Sioux and Lakota Sioux people who are hunting in the fur trade, producing pelts that they're exchanging for manufactured goods that come from Europe. And the pelts that they themselves produce are making their way through these networks and channels of Indian traders and Indian hunters through French posts and through Hudson's Bay posts back to Europe. And whether they ship back to France or they go back to England, they usually end up in London, where exiled French Huguenots who fled the continent after the destructive wars of the Reformation have become the masters of making beaver pelts into felt that is then turned into hats. And those hats are then carried by the British to China where they're traded. So you have a global market economy that connects Indian hunters who are acting effectively as workers with Chinese consumers on mainland Asia. And that is, in fact, a global market economy. And part of what happens is we don't think about Native peoples fitting into that. And this is exactly what they're doing. This is actually an attempt to position yourself in a large chain of exchange relationships in a way that's most advantageous for your community. And so in that sense, this little prologue is the success of the Dakota and the success of the Anishinaabe people from Chequamegon in situating their communities within this market, within this sort of large exchange network. And the murder of these two Frenchmen by the sons of a noted Bear Clan pipe carrier, in fact, from Keweenaw, with allies at Sault Ste. Marie, on the eastern edge of the Great Lakes, is another attempt to alter the composition and the power within this vast trans-regional alliance and exchange network. From Duluth's perspective, the murder here is about theft and robbery. So his interpretation of this event is that the traders were murdered for their goods, and that's the only explanation he sees or understands. And in this sense, it's a kind of dramatic misinterpretation of what's happening that doesn't allow him to see what's going on. So, as I said, the murder is actually an act of political violence. And so Duluth, who now finds himself back in the West, the murder happens in 1683, as I said. His initial foray that I just took you through was in 1678. He's back at Mackinac. Mackinac is here at the top of the northern peninsula of Michigan. It's another French post, another sort of choke point as you're making your way into the West. And he's basically been put in charge of keeping the alliance intact, which means keeping the fur trade going. Because really, the fur trade is New France. New France outside of the St. Lawrence River Valley doesn't exist without its Indian allies. And so for Duluth, these murders represent a challenge to his authority and to French authority. And in that sense, it's absolutely true. It's a real challenge. But again, his problem is misunderstanding the nature of this challenge. The murderers, as I said, were meant to send a message. And that message was, do not trade with the Dakota. The Dakota are our enemies. Now, a place like Mackinac represents a really good example of a place that the historian Richard White has described as the middle ground. This is a sort of village/trading post where the French and their native allies sort of have to come together and find a way to create a mutually intelligible world. This is a world that actually represents the intersection of two distinct new worlds. We think about the New World in the sense of an Atlantic New World that's created by the ideas of discovery, that's created when settler colonies are formed on the East Coast, and they bring all kinds of things that are life-changing. They bring guns, they bring steel, they bring African slaves, they bring woven cloth, domesticated animals, microbes, an ideology of racial hierarchy, and so on. And this is an Atlantic New World created by the invention of the concept of a new world, when Europeans find the Americas. And we're all really familiar with that. But there's another new world, I argue, in this book. And that other new world is a native new world. It's a place that's inland from these colonies. In fact, at this point, the Atlantic New World that represents the colonial settlements of empire is really just slivers along the coast. And the vast majority of North America is still populated and controlled politically by autonomous native peoples. But that isn't to say that there is a static world. And I think it's all too easy to think about that world as something that's unchanging. And in fact, it's being roiled by all the same things, the same microbes, the same trade goods, the same new ideas, the introduction of new peoples. It's roiled by all the same things that are happening in the Atlantic coast, only it's happening in native communities. And it's really important for us to think about that because communities are able to sort of become more powerful or less powerful, depending on how they've positioned their communities in this post-contact world. They are stronger or more vulnerable, depending on the relationships with other Indians, and with other empires. So at places like Mackinac, you have the intersection of these two worlds. This is the middle ground that Richard White described, the place where people come together and they have to make a common sense out of violence, the need for reconciliation, the meaning of kinship and alliance, the meaning of enemies and enmity. And this is what begins to happen at Duluth's watch at Mackinac. He's experienced a murder, he feels like there must be a resolution, and he sets out to make that resolution come true. As I said, the murderers were part of a political argument, and they were an argument within the Anishinaabe communities of the Great Lakes. And this was an argument that was meant to be about the Dakota. So the murders make a calculated attempt to draw the French into this argument among Anishinaabe Dodomek or Anishinaabe Baz. The two warriors, as I said, have publicly owned their actions. Everybody knows exactly who they are. And so Duluth finds himself challenged because one of these people, the person he calls the accomplice, two of the murders were the sons of Ashiganaga. A third, the man that Duluth identifies in the record solely as the accomplice, is their brother-in-law. And their brother-in-law arrives at Sault Ste. Marie seeking refuge after he joined a raiding party that raided into the Dakota country. And again, because he's made known and he's put himself at a place where there is not only a French mission but a French post, Duluth feels, quote, that the accomplice arrived at Sault Ste. Marie with 15 cabins of Sauteurs who were fleeing Chequamegon because they had struck conjointly with the Jean de Terres on the Sioux last spring, and they believed in their security and the number of their allies and friends who were there. So in his letter to the governor, Duluth says, quote, I resolved to embark at daybreak with 6 Frenchmen to join those at Sault Ste. Marie and make myself the master there. So, once again, we know about these events because Daniel Duluth is writing letters to the governor explaining what he's doing. His authority has been challenged, New France has been challenged. He's writing to the governor to explain this and explain what he's going to do to do it. And he sets off, in his mind, to arrest the accomplice who's at Sault Ste. Marie. At the same time, he also dispatches 4 Frenchmen to Keweenaw to arrest Ashiganaga and all of his sons. The person he dispatches to do that, he describes as the adopted French son of Ashiganaga. And so, at this point, I'm going to describe the series of councils that lead to a resolution of these murders, but before I do, I'd like to say a few things about translation, interpretation, geography, and demography. And first we'll start out with demography. So Duluth is leaving Mackinac for Sault Ste. Marie, according to him, to make an arrest. And basically what he's doing is he's taking 6 Frenchmen, and he's joining the 12 Frenchmen who were posted at Sault Ste. Marie. And he's entering into a village which in the fall can be from somewhere between 7,000 or 8,000 indigenous people, but often upwards as high as 10, because in the fall, people are at this post to be outfitted for the winter. People who've been trading east at Montreal or north at Hudson's Bay are making their way back to this choke point. So when Duluth claims that he's gone to arrest people and sort of take somebody back, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because what we have here are basically 18 Frenchmen and a couple thousand Indians. So they're not going to be arrested if they don't want to be arrested, and that's an important point to make, because Duluth calls a council, and at the council, basically the clan leaders and elders who are there tell him, look, this is Ashiganaga. He's the one who's behind this. His sons are responsible for this. You don't need this man, but Duluth insists that, in fact, he does. And in the end, this man consents to go with him. And at the same time, he receives word as he's making his way back to Mackinac. Well, actually, before he makes his way back, he also puts out a call to all the people in the region that they need to send their leaders to Mackinac in the spring to have a council to resolve these murders. And he makes his way back to Mackinac, and he learns that the people who have gone to secure Ashiganaga are also on their way back with him. And when they arrive, the man who has been sent to get Ashiganaga informs Daniel Duluth, Daniel Duluth, that he's brought him back. Now, one of the things I should say here is that the documents that I'm looking at, the reason that I'm talking about this is that there's also an English language version that's been published of these series of Duluth letters. They're published around the turn of the century by a guy named Reuben Gold Thwaites, who did the translations for the Jesuit Relations, and he published these letters in the Wisconsin Historical Collection, and these are the things that most people work from when they do this. So now a quick thought about translation. So first, again, demography. These people who make their way to Mackinac are not making their way because they've been coerced. The French don't have the power to do that. They're making their way to Duluth's council because they want to. And like I said, it makes sense because they've made this attack as a political statement. Now, the English language translation of this is significant in that the English language version, remember I said that the accomplice has arrived. The English language version says the accomplice arrived at Sault Ste. Marie with 15 cabins of Sauteurs because they had struck conjointly with the Jean de Terre and the Sioux. Now, the English language translation, that they arrived with 15 cabins of Sauteurs, leaves out the part that they were fleeing Chequamegon. It just says they arrived after raiding the Sioux. I'm not sure why Thwaites would have left that out. Maybe it was confusing, it didn't matter. But the point here is that I'm leaving that bit of information out from the English language version. You omit a really important thing. The raiders are not fleeing the Dakotas. The raiders are fleeing from the Chequamegon people. So they're fleeing from other Anishinaabe peoples, the Sauteurs on the west end of Lake Superior who are Manithan. That's who they're seeking refuge from. Now, another thought about translation is the term Jean de Terre, which remains untranslated in the English language version of this. This is a French phrase that kind of is a rough translation of Nopaming Dajeni, which is a sort of Ojibwe language term that's used for bush people in the country. These are the people of the north that Daniel Duluth was warned about by Wamamin. So that's who's joined the Bear Clan people and the people of Sault Ste. Marie on the raid. These people from the north, people that are not permanent residents for these big lakeside villages, but essentially the country cousins of the Anishinaabe, people who, as I said, have access and ties to the English as well as the French, who are preferring to keep themselves sort of moving back and forth between empires without aligning themselves with either one in particular. Now, later on in the same letter, Duluth goes one step farther and identifies the Nicoleni. The Nicoleni, which he spells Nik''Ellamy, which is a rough sort of French phonetic translation of the Neka-Ani, which is the goose people, or the goose dodem. And this is an important sort of another way for us to think about this, because it also identifies this people. These are more specific. These are people who are in the Rainy Lake region at this time period, which is sort of north of the Sioux territory, west of where the Sauteurs from Chequamegon are. Now, interpretation in terms of thinking about these translation issues and thinking about the way these Indian language words make their way into the French document, it can kind of change or deepen our interpretation of the politics surrounding the murder of these two French people. The accomplished, who's linked also to the Jean de Terre, or the Neka-Dodem, people of the north, are specifically in alliance against the Dakota. They're vying for control of the same hunting territory. So it's important for us to remember, as I said, that the people who are sort of at the heart of this battle aren't just the Dakota, but also factions within the larger Anishinaabe world. That they've fled the people of Chequamegon, that's who they're afraid of. And we have a kind of another interpretive piece here, and that we figure out exactly who they're raiding when they raid the Dakota country. The Yankton Sioux, who are sort of the middle Siouan people between the Dakota in the east and the Lakota in the west, have a winter count that records this raid from people in the north. So we know that that raid happened on the Yankton people, and that also makes sense in an interpretive way, because the Yankton people were the primary traders. They were facilitating exchange between the Dakota in the east with access to trade goods and the Lakota on the plains who did not have clear access to trade goods. So striking them, if you were trying to break up that alliance, would make a lot of sense. So with all these people arrayed, with the sort of an understanding of who's involved in this murder and what's at stake for the people involved, we have people converging at Mackinac for Duluth's counsel. As I said, he sent out word, and everybody comes back, and they make their way to the Duluth post at Mackinac. And when they do, the person who's got Ashiganaga lets Daniel Duluth know that he took all the sons captive except for the youngest son. And he wrote that he had released the youngest son to make known, quote, this is a quote, to make known to those of their nation, the Sauteurs, being Noka, who were in the reason that the French had taken their fathers. Now, another quick note on translation, the English language version of this actually changes the meaning of this. This version simply notes that the son was released to explain his father's arrest, to make known to their tribe and to the Sauteurs and to the Noka who were in the region. Now, first note the use of tribe, which is sort of different than nation. And I think from a person translating this in the early 20th century, often they translate nation as tribe. I think it implies a kind of more primitive social body. It implies less sort of, it's less grandiose or less fully imagined as nation, but that's a kind of small point. The more important thing is that he translates this sentence to read as if the son were being sent to bring the news of their father's arrest to his tribe, one, to the Sauteurs, two, and to the Noka, as if there were three distinct social formations, when in fact, in the original French, they are one. They are a trinity, if you will. He's being asked to make known to those of their nation and to the Sauteurs, being Noka, who are in the region, why they have arrested his father. And this is a crucial thing to admit, because the difference here is that we identify for the first time the Ashiganaga being Noka or Bear Clan. So in other words, he read this, he sent the son to make known to their nation, the Sauteurs, being Noka, being Bear Clan. And that's the first time we have evidence that he's been identified as Bear Clan. And as I said, it's all the difference, because it makes the identification of Ashiganaga as a war leader, as somebody who might in fact be called upon or expected to fight against the attempts to make peace with a long-term enemy. It might be expected, in fact, to be recruited by rivals who wanted to stop this. And it provides a sense of motivation that's otherwise missing from Duluth's assessment, right? It's not just a random act of violence, it's a political act. It's an act that involves a power struggle with enormous stakes in terms of the fur trade, in terms of political power, in terms of the social status of people in this larger world that's linked to the fur trade in the global world economy. So learning this information is hugely important. So as people gather at confession, at the tribal council for Duluth, what he thinks of as a murder trial, and he described it as such in his letters to the governor, but what he's really done is called a council. And so people come, and they've been called a council, and people come from throughout the Great Lakes, they gather at Mackinac, and they meet, and very quickly, the sons of Ashiganaga and the brother-in-law confess to what they've done. They've killed this French traders. They argue a little bit about whose idea it was, and they deny that Ashiganaga had any role in this. Daniel Duluth finds that incredible. He believes that Ashiganaga is at the heart of this. And in the end, they confess pretty early, and the council comes to a conclusion, and they tell the accused killers, quote, according to Duluth, quote, "This is enough. The Frenchman is now the masters of your body." And at first, Duluth is satisfied with this deliberation. But then he realizes this is sort of where they're stopping, because the Anishinaabe peoples who are gathered here don't see the council as an adversarial process. They don't see it as a trial, and they don't see themselves as a jury. Duluth becomes furious because he realizes they're not making any sort of other recommendation. They're just saying you are now the master of their bodies. And so he fumes in his letter to the governor. He says, for all their counsels, quote, they've done nothing more than reduce tobacco to ash, unquote. And then he promises them that tomorrow, first thing in the morning, he's going to tell them what the French plan to do in response to this. Now, it's important, I think, to think about what it is that Ashiganaga expected to happen when he allowed Duluth to become the master of the bodies of his sons and his son-in-law. And what he expected was something that would reflect the alliance process, that would reflect the relationship as Inamawag, as related people, as relatives had with one another when they needed to resolve a crisis, even something as serious and deadly as a murder. They would expect a process that combined raising the dead and covering the dead. These were terms that were used as part of the ritual healing process. Raising the dead could involve something like providing prisoners or slaves to replace the people who had been lost. Or if the people were more high status, it could involve trading high status persons to Duluth. So in this case, what Ashiganaga could have expected was that he would give his sons up and Duluth would become the master of their bodies, and they would be brought into Duluth's post, to his house. They would take the place of the fallen French people. Now, this was a really important move, in part because by accepting his responsibility as the master of the lives of these people, Duluth would then be tacitly accepting the act that brought them there in the first place. That is, he would be accepting tacitly that what they did, the French, by trading with the Sioux, was wrong. And this would sort of undermine the alliance that had been made. And it would also reaffirm the alliance by putting the sons of Ashiganaga, noted war leader, in the house of Daniel Duluth. This is what he expected. He also expected that this might involve covering the dead, which is a process of gift giving to make up for the loss that's been suffered by the person who has been acted upon. And in fact, Ashiganaga and the Sauteurs from Keweenaw offered Duluth a series of presents at the same time this council was happening. And Duluth is furious about this because he says, I will not be bribed. You cannot pay me for the blood of Frenchmen. And again, Duluth is seeing this in the context of empire, not in the context of the social world that he's living in, which is a sort of hybrid of a native social world and an Indian social world. And so he rejects the attempt to cover the dead, and he claims that he will make his decision about what he will do as master of the bodies of these three young men on the next day. And Ashiganaga at this point probably thinks of himself as being pretty successful. It's a shrewd move. It's risky, but he's now sort of closed off, he thinks, the French sanctioning of an alliance with the Dakota. He's placed his sons closer to the French and to Duluth himself, who is the person in charge of the French fur trade. So it's a pretty smart move in terms of the politics of this, in terms of the array of people who are aligned to trade and to control the flow of trade goods. But what happens the next day when Duluth comes back to the council is he announces that he's going to put the three men to death. Now, the minute he makes this announcement, pandemonium ensues. People are upset. They begin to argue with Duluth, explain to him what it means to be the master of the bodies of these young men, that it means generosity, that it means that he needs to act like a father. And this is a constant sort of refrain in the relationships between the French and their Indian allies, is that they have different conceptions of what a father is. Duluth, like many French people, has a fairly patriarchal sense of what a father is. A father sort of rules over a family. He's authoritative. And in an Anishinaabe context, a father doesn't do that. He doesn't rule over people. He takes care of people. He takes care of his family. He provides for them. And so they're asking him, they're telling him, you need to be a father. You need to show generosity. You need to take these young men into your home. And Duluth, after this goes on for half the day, says, fine, I will not kill all three of them. I'll operate on your principles. I'll only kill two. We'll take a life for a life. And once again, he's justifying what he's doing, but he thinks by terms that should make sense to an Anishinaabe person. But again, he's misconstrued the difference between acting with relatives and the Maya Gazid, the foreign. And this is, in fact, what you would do if the Iroquois had raided into Anishinaabe territory and killed two Frenchmen. The Anishinaabe might raise a war party and go kill some Iroquois in response, maybe even bring back Iroquois prisoners. That would be a sort of mourning war process where a death would be paid for with another death. But that's not something that you did with allies. So when the pandemonium breaks out and Duluth makes his compromise, and it seems as if everything is about to go crazy, Wamamin inserts himself yet again into this process. And as the elders are trying to talk Duluth down from killing the two people, now less than three, Wamamin stands up, and according to Duluth, he thanked me. He, quote, thanked me for being content with so little. And he praised the good heart of the Frenchman who was going to release the father and at least three of his sons. And then he writes that an hour afterward, quote, I put myself at the head of 42 Frenchmen, in the sight of 400 warriors or 400 men, 200 steps from their fort, I broke their heads. So in other words, in one quick change of plans, Duluth says he will execute two people. They're trying to further talk him down from executing two people, and he decides then that he's had enough, and he's going to kill two people. So Ashiganaga watched his oldest son be tomahawked to death by Daniel Duluth. A fairly bold move that he's done. He's taken these people at Mackinac, an even bigger village than Sault Ste. Marie, taken them outside of the gates of his fort, and literally crushed their skulls. Two people dead. When this happens, if pandemonium had erupted before when he pronounces his sentence, it positively wild pandemonium ensues after the execution. And what happens is first that the people who are resident at Mackinac, mostly Odawa people, who are like a national designation similar to the Sauteurs, who are the village, the main people of the village where the council has been called, they furiously began throwing feast where they invite the Keweenaw Sauteurs, the Sault Ste. Marie Sauteurs, and they begin to give out presents. They begin to do a ritual feast, an Eid-all feast. They offer wampum belts. The Huron, who are also at this point close allies with Odawa and also living at Mackinac, do the same thing. They immediately call for feasts. They begin to give wampum presents they're having sent to the visiting Sauteurs. At this point, in fact, all the people who are there, the Potawatomi bands who are there, also begin to have feasts. They too are giving gifts of wampum to the Sauteurs. And what they're doing, they're trying to prevent what they see as a major breach within the alliance, a major breach that could result in warfare internally and really not only disrupt the French alliance system, but really disrupt the social kinship network of the Anishinaabe peoples. And so as all this gift-giving and alliance-making or attempts to repair alliances going on, Duluth is also approached by the fur traders who winter year-round. Duluth doesn't stay year-round. He comes and goes. But there are handfuls of people. When he takes the 6 Frenchmen, those are Frenchmen who live permanently in this region. And they are most often married with Indian wives. They speak the language. And they basically go to Duluth and they inform him, he writes in the letter to the governor, that he's placed all their lives in jeopardy. And they're able finally to get him alone and convince him that, in fact, what he's done is not only incredibly stupid, but really, really dangerous. And Duluth, who up to this point has been insisting on a rule of law, realizes that he, in fact, has endangered not only his men, but himself. And so he does what he said he wouldn't do. He starts himself to cover the dead. And he doesn't just engage in the gift giving that everybody else is giving and giving general feasts. He goes specifically to the family of Ashiganaga. And he essentially takes all the trade goods that he's brought with him to trade for the year, and he gives them to his family. He wrote, quote, that he furnished them with everything they needed in the name of their father, the governor, given them by my hand blankets, guns, powder, lead, tobacco, axes, knives, twine for making nets, shirts, leggings, socks, tobacco, sacks of wheat, unquote. And so he's basically engaged in this process of covering dead. This is Richard White's kind of middle ground, a process which people often think as a sort of coming together, but really the middle ground is a place that is usually unsatisfying for everybody who's on it. Nobody gets their way. Everybody has compromised versions of their own culture being spat back at them by somebody else. And this is what Duluth has done. He's insisted on rule of law. He said, these Indians have done a savage thing. They've murdered some people. They've got to pay the price. And so he's put them to death. And then he learns that, in fact, that's really dangerous. And high-minded principle or not, if he wants to get out of here alive, he should do what they do, cover the dead. So that's happened. Nobody's particularly satisfied. Ashiganaga, I'm sure, is stunned. His oldest son has been killed by his supposed ally, Daniel Duluth. His brilliant political maneuver has been undone. And when it could seem like it could be no worse, it gets worse. Because at this point, Wammen stands up in the middle of Duluth's gift-giving ceremony, and he himself gives strands of wampum, white wampum, to the family of Ashiganaga. And of course, this is a signifier of peace. And by accepting this, which they have to do, they've accepted the words that come with it. And from Ashiganaga, according to Duluth, says that he's giving, quote, some collars of wampum in order that they, the family of Ashiganaga, might take good care and that no trouble be made over the death of their brother, in order that they should have evil designs that they will restrain themselves in the future. So at this point, not only has Ashiganaga's brilliant political tactic been unsettled, but Wammen has come in yet again and now reaffirmed that alliance and held them at bay. They can't now launch an additional retaliation or raid into the Shawamon territory, into the Dakota country, because they've been not only gifted by Duluth, but they've been gifted wampum by Wammen himself. And so they depart utterly defeated politically, and they depart with the Shawamon Anishinaabe people utterly triumphant at this point. They've preserved this alliance. And I think it's really important to think about that in this sense, because as I said, part of the failures of interpretation here for Daniel Duluth is that he couldn't see beyond the small scale of the alliance and the limited claims of the French Empire. And he didn't see that there was something else going on. And this is finally the last category that I want to talk about, the geography, a category of geography and the geography of power in the native New World. Viewed from a limited perspective of empire, the conflict with Duluth and his men represented a struggle between the French father and his native children to control the terms and conditions of their relationship. The murders and their resolution were in fact a product of this struggle, and that struggle defined New France from its inception till it went out of business after the end of the 7 Years' War. Ashiganaga and Wammen, however, were playing at a much larger game. They were locked in a fierce battle to determine the place of the Lake Superior Anishinaabe within the native New World, being reshaped by the fur trade and its connection to the larger global market economy. And while this was not apparent to Duluth, through translation and interpretation of the indigenous languages embedded in his own letters, we can see this larger struggle revealed. Now, to kind of wrap things up, I want to share a few more thoughts on sort of the world of empire. This is yet another French map, which actually probably looks more accurate, and that is, it leaves the middle blank, because the French have no idea what's going on with the territory that they've just claimed from Duluth. And I think this fits in with this sort of meta-narrative about American history that we all have, and how we think about Native history and American history in particular. And that meta-narrative usually is to kind of leave the indigenous part of the world blank, to leave it as an empty space, a thing that's waiting to be signified or be filled with meaning when Americans arrive or when Europeans arrive. And in a sense, that was Duluth's shortcoming. He couldn't see that space as anything but a blank space. And if we think about the meta-narrative in American history, when we think about moments when Indians really matter, they're kind of few and far between. They matter at founding moments. So think your Pocahontas, think your Squanto, think your purchase of Manhattan. In those cases, Indians all matter because they're sort of bequeathing the continent to the newly arrived Europeans. They are fashioning a new world by allowing the new people of the new world to come and establish themselves. Indians also matter, I think, importantly in the 7 Years' War and Revolution, which is really kind of a struggle for what empires will do with the continent east of the Mississippi. Will they expand? Will they remain in the coast? So Indians matter in this. In fact, Americans call it a French and Indian War. This is another moment when Indians are consequential, and if you're thinking about big surveys, when your average undergraduate student would know this, would think about Indians as being important. Another period of Indians' importance is the era of removal in the 1830s, when Indians, again, are important because they are being removed, a very tragic stain in American history, removal being a euphemism for ethnic cleansing. And that's another moment when Indians show up, when kids can tell you about that. Most undergraduates can tell you about Indian removal. And then I think the final big moment where Indians matter in the sort of meta-narrative that people have in their heads about American history are the Custer battles. The Great Plains battles that we think about with Custer, which is amazing. And it's a moment we're thinking about in terms of not just the spectacular success of the Sioux, who were able to defeat basically an industrialized nation. In part, it's a defeat because Custer's an idiot, but it's also a defeat because they have a coalition of militarized equestrian peoples, the Lakota Sioux, their various allies, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and they've become the major power outside the United States in the northern Great Plains. They've conquered space, they've taken territory, and they've done it using guns and horses, two things that are not indigenous. They have remade themselves, and in part, that process of being remade happens in this moment with these murder trials, the struggle whether or not the Dakota will be able to gain access consistently to European trade goods. So nothing was going on in this blank space, and yet everything is going on. The Sioux people are remaking themselves into a Plains Buffalo people that are mounted in on horseback, that are conquerors, so that when the Americans arrive, they look at them as just yet another challenge for their conquest and control of the best buffalo territory in North America. And that's something that you can attribute to this early period. And you don't think about the Dakota in the 1670s and 80s, but they were actually phenomenally important in terms of the politics of the Native New World, and they have consequences not only in the colonial period, but in the national period when the Americans roll their way west. They're able, in fact, they are stopped on the plains because of this long history of Sioux peoples evolving that begins at this moment. And another thing that we could think about, going back to removal, and also speaking about this moment, is the fact that, in fact, in the Great Lakes, Indians avoid removal. Anishinaabe peoples, by and large, avoid removal. Some Anishinaabe people are removed that are in Illinois, or the lower Michigan, Indiana. But for the most part, the Anishinaabe people hold on to their homelands. And this is in part because the fur trade and this whole process allows them to sort of pivot toward the west. So when other Indians are facing east, people like the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Cherokee, and they're being sort of hitting the sort of crushing weight of American expansion. They're fighting that off. They're exposed to disease. Their trade is being ravaged. Their lands are being taken. And you have a pretty marked demographic decline. And this is the sort of thing that fuels the fantasy of vanishing Indians in American ideology and popular culture. Well, the Anishinaabe peoples buck that trend. They actually grow during this time period. Their numbers expand, and they expand into territory in the West. They increase the size of their territory, which is remarkable for 19th century Native peoples in the United States. They actually expand the scope of their territory. They increase demographically, and they're able, as a matter as a consequence of this, to actually resist removal, hold on to their homelands. Now, they are largely dispossessed, and it's the project that I'm working on now, and the dispossession is itself also a tragedy, but the fact is they do maintain their homelands, they do stay on, and it's in part also, again, because of this move, how they align themselves in this early colonial period when they were really important political actors, probably some of the most important political actors that you'll never hear of, or that you'll never hear of in a standard classroom or academic textbook. And so the final thoughts are that with the help of a little translation, we can kind of recover this past history, the history of a continent, and we can learn that actually that continent's history, American history, is actually an indigenous history. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you, Michael. Michael will take a few questions if you have any.
Michael, thank you so much. I'm going to cheat a little bit because you gave me the Cliff Notes version of the talk. How much do we know about the history of mistranslation in the difference between the manuscript edition and the print relation? And why do we continue to assign the print relation, or why do we put it on graduate comps? Why is this the edition that we continue to use and to cite?
Short answer, America. Where we speak
Yes.
English. Yeah, that really is the short answer. It's a good point, but I think it's changing. People are looking for manuscript sources now. Several things are different. One, actually, when I did the research for this, it was a lot harder to get at those manuscripts. Actually, that's how I got the Fulbright, because I was the only guy applying for a Fulbright in Paris who didn't want to study the French Revolution. I was actually there for the Indians, and they were like, "Wow, that's weird." But now those documents are online through the Canadian Archives, so they're more accessible, and I think it's easier for people to use, whereas before they weren't, and so people used this translated version. And when I went there, Richard White, who was my advisor, and had just written The Middle Ground, in part using a lot of those sources, kind of to make the argument that Americans, we can access this stuff. So he used all these translated versions, and he told me, don't get anything that's already been translated, which, after reading a lot of Thwaites translations, I thought that's stupid because this guy wasn't the best translator. And so I got this and I actually sat with it, and I don't think in my dissertation I noticed these differences, but I did start to notice them when I was revising the dissertation to a book, and I noticed that there were these huge differences in terms of translations. And so I think that in terms of assigning them for undergraduates especially, it's because they also don't read French. But I found that happens all over in all these translated stuff. The documents relative to the colonial history of New York, a big series of translations, those are often bad. And I think stuff like when he leaves out that they're fleeing, not the Dakotas, but the Shawamagon, that I think maybe it didn't make sense to him, so he left it out without knowing the larger story. So that's it. Short answer, America.
Michael, would you advocate for some strategic retranslations and new editions of some of these documents so that our non-foreign, non-Anglo-only students can use them?
I would absolutely advocate for that, for sure. I mean, the other thing that's happening is people are also working with native languages more than I think they used to. And, I myself, I was talking to Allison, I was like, I read this stuff. Nobody, in the French versions, they don't explain Noke, Bear Clan, they don't explain that. And the English language translations, they not only don't explain it, they don't translate it. But then I realized you could actually find quite a few Ojibwe language words that are embedded in these documents, and you just kind of read over them and don't think about it. So that's another thing that's happened. People are starting to work with native languages more and trying to both figure out the French stuff, but also the Indian stuff. And I would actually absolutely advocate for any new translations of any of those things. It'd be great.
Hi, thank you. This was so fascinating. I had a question about, I was really struck by how you were talking about these different understandings of empire and patriarchal systems of governance. And I was wondering if there are instances of the different cultures involved in that negotiation, thinking through or trying to understand the fact that they say the same word, but they mean something different. So think through the difference in those governing structures. And if there are ways in which, for example, the French Empire on the ground is adapting their understanding of their imperial system because of their participation in the creation of these new cultures. And then if so, I guess in addition to moments of where that creates misunderstanding, moments where that kind of creates new structures or negotiations.
Yeah, there's a lot of variation on the ground, and part of it is if you look at, say, Daniel Duluth versus Nicolas Perrault, who's fluent in Anishinaabe, who spends his life out there and also writes a memoir. He's much smarter. He has a much more realistic sense of what's going on. Duluth is kind of a dilettante, so he doesn't. And you get that with the various French actors, depending on how much they know or don't know. And you can certainly find instances when other people are sort of fully immersing themselves in the native sort of world around them. There are instances, for example, one of the things I love teaching is that you've got a moment where the Jesuits, the Odawa, have captured an Iroquois. Who are at this point before 1701 the enemies of New France, and they're really frustrated with the French, so they're going to use those captives and try to negotiate a peace separately from the French with the Iroquois. And the Jesuit priest who's there knows that will be absolutely in the worst interests of France, begins to furiously demand that they boil and eat the Iroquois. And it's not a figurative boil and eat. He's demanding that they actually ritually consume this guy, and he convinces them to do so. And so you've got this French priest participating in a moment when a pretty indigenous ritual, and he's sort of using that, and he inflames them by talking about these things that we've talked about, raising the dead, covering the dead, what their responsibilities are to their kin, and he convinces them on their own terminology to, in fact, kill these prisoners. And he's doing it for strategic reasons that have to do with France. And you see lots of moments like that where you have some French people who are pretty smart and some Native people who are pretty smart, and they're manipulating each other. But often you also get the clumsy stuff that shows up more with officers who are just there in and out and who provide the best written records. So you get a mix of both.
I have a question about your methodology. When you're working on translating, out of layer upon layer of mistranslations, I'm wondering how you go about this process, right? You showed us both
an English mistranslation of a French text, and you were talking about French misunderstandings of what's going on. How do you get to this new history that you write from a different perspective with the archives that you're drawing on?
Well, I think relying on the manuscript sources is a huge thing, as opposed to the translated sources. Not accepting the translations is one thing. And some of it, I was talking with Allison before, some of it was just sitting with the documents for a long time. And I found myself also reading through these French phoneticized Ojibwe words that I was just kind of reading, and they're French phoneticized, but in my head, when I'm reading them, I'm pronouncing them with how I would in English, and so OU, which would be oo in French, is really kind of a wa, or oo in English is wa in French, and there are a couple words like, oh, if I say this is a wa, then this sounds like wama, and this, oh, this makes sense as an Ojibwe word. So part of it was just getting myself to think like that, to look at the French document, remember to use French pronunciation, and then a lot of these words that get printed that nobody translates are actually Ojibwe words, and if you spend some time with them, you can figure those out. So it just, I think, just kind of careful reading. For this sources, I also used Francis Baraga, who's got an Ojibwe language dictionary, which is closer to that time, because there's obvious changes from the 17th and 18th century to the present. That's a really helpful kind of document to work with. So I'll read the French stuff with my Baraga dictionary right next to me, and just work back and forth like that.
Thank you so much for your talk. I guess I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between text and map, because you were describing the ways in which these maps are
Between
produced.
text and what?
Text and map. So the maps that are produced for these very different purposes, and how they do or don't contribute to our understandings, the close textual reading that you're doing as well, as opposed to maps being illustrative.
I'm sorry, between text and you're saying and not?
And maps.
Oh,
M-A-P,
maps. I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Oh, that's okay. Oh, between text and maps. Yeah, so I found maps super handy. For that reason, one, because I kind of loved maps and the visual representation, so I've always liked maps as text, but the French maps in particular, Jesuit maps especially, are really excellent because they often have these phoneticized French words, and so you can do things like identify Dodom and place them in spots and territories, or identify sometimes indigenous place names. So I found that reading the maps was really helpful, and if you read them alongside of these sort of text documents, I find it really handy. One of the best ones, or some of the best ones, like I said, are the Jesuit ones. There's one I use in this book, actually the map that I started with, this one. This is a map. It's published in the Jesuit Relations. It's produced as part of a textual document, and the document sort of is a narrative of the claims of the French to have discovered and taken possession formally of all of North America from Sault Ste. Marie. And it's super handy in the sense that the text is written to go with the map, and as I pointed out, in this map there are no Indian people, but there's just missions, and the text explains what Indians are associated with what missions. And so in that sense, I think, especially like that, when they're actually talking to each other, it's super handy. But even when they're not, with like the Hennepin map, for example, same thing. He uses kind of French phonetic pronunciations to locate various Dakota peoples at different spaces and different times. So I think just treating the maps as text and working with them alongside the written documents or the manuscript documents is enormously productive.
I wonder if you could say a bit more about the decision to kill 2 sons rather than 3. And it struck me that you did such a nice elucidation of what the aims of getting the sons into the household were. Was there a decision to kill the older son because that was of greater symbolic value within a French framework, or how was that decision made, and can you know?
It's hard to say. I mean, and so Duluth, my sense from how Duluth writes about it is that it's exactly that. He's the older son, and I believe Duluth seems to imply that he was more responsible being the older son, and that he would take his life and spare the younger ones. And so also because the younger sons were younger, they were younger men, that it was more of a merciful gesture. And at one point actually says he thought he should put all of the Ashiganaga sons to death. So at one point in the council, I left that out, but at one point that's what he's starting to do. And I think at the time people are thinking about, in the council, I think people are at first taking this as a metaphorical death. It's very clear from his talk that they're on different wavelengths. Duluth is actually talking about killing them. They're actually thinking about the metaphorical death of giving your sons up to another person and their ritual adoption by that person. And it's really, I think, stunning for them in the end when this happens, and it happens really fast, because he not only changes his mind, but then you have Wama interjecting himself in saying, yep, okay, we'll take this deal, because it serves his purpose too. And when he does kill those sons, it's very quick, and it does, you get the sense, he doesn't say that he writes that he becomes scared, and he also writes that his traders start coming up to him and saying, you've put us all in jeopardy. So I think his decision was based on those sorts of things, but I can kind of know as much as he tells me, and that's kind of what he says. But I also, when I think about this, I think how stunning it must have been for Ashikaga to have his sons, to have done something pretty risky with his sons, but thought he got away with it at one point, or at least that he'd really triumphed, and then very quickly to have his own son killed by a supposed ally. And it makes me wonder at Duluth, the man must be an idiot. I mean, who bludgeons to death somebody in front of a village of thousands and thousands of people? So I think that's the other part. Part of it was strategic, part of it was Duluth being an idiot.
So I was interested in the manuscript itself and kind of the tone and the audience, because I was struck by the same story as you were telling it the first time, and you were describing his realization, Duluth's realization, and his admission that he had screwed up. And this seemed to me, I'm not familiar with Duluth at all, but this seemed to me a sort of unusual kind of admission for a late 17th century official to make to his superiors. And so I was just curious about the tone and the audience of the nature of the manuscript.
So his audience is Governor Frontenac, and he's kind of saying he made a mistake, but he's also justifying. So in one breath, he admits the mistake, and he explains that he, in fact, had to give all of his trade goods to this family, which is, whether he wants to admit it or not, is kind of evidence that he'd made a mistake. But at the same time in the letter, he's continuing to say that he also frames this at the beginning and at the end of his letter by saying he's sort of upheld French sovereignty, and that we have to make these people aware, these native people aware, that they can't take French lives, spill French blood without paying a price. So he's made a mistake, he admits that, but at the same time, when he writes to the governor, he claims that he's done the correct thing. So he's sort of prevaricating, going back and forth. But his larger message is that this has preserved French sovereignty. So.
Okay, so when he does this, it's sort of course, to set the precedent, right? But I'm just wondering, do you know what happens afterwards in terms of was actually killing the sons? Did that prevent more murders from happening in the future? Or I'm wondering about that. Thank you.
So it does, it is successful. So the move by Wamaman here is also pretty brilliant, because as he's being gifted by Duluth, he adds his gift to it, which is a wampum belt, and he sort of binds him to this arrangement, because he gives him the gift, and by accepting it, he's accepting the words that go with it, which is that you will not raid in the West. And in fact, what happens is the raids, they never fully go away, in part because you have people that the French think of as Sauteurs, who are the main residents at Sault Ste. Marie, along with the Odawas at Mackinac, certainly the main people at Chequamegon. But then you've got all these people who are also Anishinaabe speakers from the north, tons of different Dodem, smaller clans, smaller peoples who are at times at these villages, but are really people from the north, and they are also much more aligned with the Cree and their Assiniboine allies, so they continue to sort of perpetrate violence. But for the next 40 or 50 years, there are not raids from the Odawa and the Sauteurs and the Great Lakes into the Dakota country, by and large. They kind of preserve that alliance. The Dakota never fully make it sort of into the family of native allies as the French do. At one point, the people of Chequamegon do bring a Dakota political leader to Montreal, and he actually presents him there, and he using the language of empire, he says, "I'm a bastard in search of a father," and the governor pledges that he will in fact, accept him into the nation of his children. But that individual dies in Montreal during his visit. He gets sick and dies. And has a big consequence politically for the Sioux. The other big consequence of this, actually, that I think is really interesting is that it's successful, and there are Anishinaabe and Dakota people who are intermarrying, and they continue to sort of live and hunt together. And what happens is you've got people like Green Bay, like the Meskwaki or the Fox, who are kind of refugees fleeing the Iroquois Wars, and they regard the Dakota as their enemies, and so they frequently raid into, and they're also trying to push out into the plains, and they frequently raid into these Dakota villages, and they take captives, and they come back with them. On multiple occasions, when they take these captives and get back to their village, they find that they have some Anishinaabe people mixed in with the Sioux people. And once that happens, it keeps it triggers both rounds of violence as Shagwamagan Anishinaabe people raid into the Sioux country. It makes the French have to go out and negotiate their releases. So there are lots of ongoing political consequences, but by and large, it's pretty successful until about 1730s and 40s, when it begins to sort of fall apart, that Dakota Anishinaabe alliance.
Thanks for the fascinating talk. I had a question about the global market economy and sort of what the Native participants' participation in it meant for their sense of the world.
That's a really good question. I think it also speaks to, so for Dana Duluth, everything's kind of small and regional, and he doesn't think that Native peoples are thinking about the world. But my sense is that absolutely they understand that they are engaged in a trade process that's connecting them to people in other spaces. And I think, in fact, the Great Lakes in particular is a pretty sophisticated place. It's pretty cosmopolitan. You have places like Sault Ste. Marie and Mackinac, and there's people speaking multiple dialects of Anishinaabe. You've got the Huron there, you've got the French there, you've got traders coming up from French Louisiana. These are places where there are well-traveled people with connections to Europe, people with connections to the Great Plains. So I don't think in any sense that they find themselves isolated. And I think, in fact, what they realize is that they know what is at the Eastern Shore. And in fact, you see this more in the 19th century negotiations when Ojibwe people are aware of the threat posed to them, particularly by the Americans, who they realize is a different sort of kind of creature because these people are after territory and land, not furs. But my sense is that they do have a sense of themselves. People like Wamaman, he shows up in several different documents. He's an orator. He would have been a person who could master the different dialects. He shows up in speaking moments. So I think there's a way in which people do realize they're engaged with empire, with the larger world. I don't know that these guys imagine their hats being sold in China. But I do think that they see that they are part of this larger thing that connects them to empire, to Europe, to a larger economy.
Okay, well, let's thank Michael for his wonderful talk. Thank you.